David Cameron, John Kerry, the Australian PM, John Abbott, all pointing the finger of blame at Russia. Is it Russia's fault?
Well, according to this Western narrative, it is. Well, I've been wondering if it's not putting sort of the cart before the horse. You first name your culprit, and then you suggest that an investigation is needed, after all.
What's the narrative in Russia at the moment, then?
Well, actually, I looked at the front pages of some of the bigger newspapers before I came on, and they all featured Obama statements, asking or demanding of Putin to provide whatever it is that Putin needs to provide. So, plus, of course, the defense ministry, the Russian defense ministry briefing is featured prominently, suggesting that there was a Ukrainian fighter jet in the vicinity of MH17 around the time it came down.
But of course, if Russia wasn't involved in Crimea, none of this would make any difference, would it?
If nothing happened in nothing untoward happened in Kiev in February, we wouldn't be here. If Kiev listened to Moscow and some others calling for a ceasefire and for a dialogue between East Ukraine and Kiev, none of this would have been happening.
We'll get onto the background in just a moment, but first, Michael, I mean, do you think President Putin is actually listening to the outside world here?
Yes, I think he is, because he's under immense pressure, and he's on the wrong side of this one, fairly clearly. Dimitri's right that the media often jump to the wrong conclusions too quickly, but in this case, they've been completely right. I mean, all the evidence is all circumstantial, but it all points in the same direction. And I think Mr. Putin realizes that. And this is bad for his credibility, even in the world that doesn't oppose him more viscerally in the way that the West has tended to do in recent years. So he's got a real problem. He's got a real problem. He's got to decide now whether to be an internationalist about this or whether to try and brass it out, brazen it out, and see if it gets better. Because
Dimitri says, and a lot of the point of view in Russia is, that if Kiev had listened to Russia, none of this would have happened. But then Kiev was looking towards the West. It was looking at joining the EU, this is the background to all of this, isn't it?
Yes, it is. The EU mishandled the relations with Kiev back in November. But Mr. Putin has now given himself exactly what he didn't want. Last November, he wanted a pro-Russian, non-EU inclined Ukraine. And now he's got a vehemently anti-Russian, pro-EU inclined Ukraine. In compensation for that, he's annexed Crimea, which has actually done him no good in the wider world. So actually, Mr. Putin, in the long term, is weaker now than he was before. He doesn't see it that way. He's cock-a-hoop about all of this. But in the long term, he is strategically weaker than he was.
Do you agree with that, Dimitri?
Well, I would agree with that, actually. The plan for any sort of annexation of Crimea, as it is termed, or reunification, as most Crimeans see it, it was never on the table. But the situation was turned in such a way that, Russia had no choice, at least that's what the Kremlin saw it as, but to act.
But there are ways and means. If the majority of people in Crimea wanted to rejoin Russia, as you put it, it should have been done at the ballot box, not by arming militias there who could then shoot down passenger
how
jets.
It was done. It's
it was done after the fact, wasn't it? They went to the vote after the fact.
They did vote for reunification with Russia, and you can recognize it or not. That's a sort of a moot point. But the whole situation with post-Soviet borders in the former Soviet Union is such a bag of tricks that, it's very difficult to see from outside what the situation is and what people really feel and want to do.
A couple of messages from our viewers. David Davis on Facebook says, I think everyone believes they're not directly responsible for bringing down the plane. Russia was responsible for selling or perhaps giving the weapons to the separatists who brought it down. And Michael, they could now face even stronger sanctions from the West. Will that make a difference?
That's quite likely. I mean, there's a group, sanctions were drawn up yesterday. I think they'll be put to a meeting of foreign ministers tomorrow. I suspect when the NATO summit assembles on the 4th and 5th of September, there will be a much stronger reaction. I mean, this event has crossed a line, actually, because it brings the Ukraine crisis to other people's doorstep, to the Dutch, to the Americans, to the British, to the Australians. It internationalizes it in a way that will make it a lot more difficult for Mr. Putin not to have his fingerprints on it.
We are almost out of time, but briefly, Dimitri, Russia must be wishing this had never happened.
Well, interesting that, the Ukraine conflict now is at everybody's doorstep.
Yeah,
before we preferred, or the West preferred, not to see it, to pretend that, there's no civil war in the country, and that was kind of in line with the West narrative. It isn't.